speaker. We are fortunate that there wasn't a travel ban for people coming from Canada, and so therefore we're happy to greet you too. And we would like to have these two barflies come in and talk to us about their viewpoints that they have. It's Randal Rauser is the Christian, actually Randal. It just seemed too easy to do. Randal Rauser, okay. So, and Justin Schieber, he's the atheist, and Rauser is the Christian. Justin, let's see. Randal is a professor of historical theology at Taylor Seminary. He has a PhD from King's College in London. Published 10 books so far, including the book that's for sale in the back, An Atheist and a Christian Walk into a Bar, which just so happens to be the talk for today. He has a blog at randalrauser.com. Justin is a co-host and on Reasonable Doubts radio show and podcast. He's the host on the YouTube, realtheology.com, video on contemporary academic and philosophy of religion. He has argued first for and against God in debates. I mean to ask him, does he ever debate himself? Okay? He's a one-man debating show, actually. Today's debate will be on the title of the book, as I said. Let's give them a big hand for Randal Rauser and Justin Schieber.
How's everybody doing?
I'm Randal.
And I'm Justin.
I'm the guy from Canada who was nervous that I might get my smartphone searched going across the border yesterday. What we were thinking of doing is like maybe 5-minute just general comments, opening it up, and then having dialogue with the audience. Does that work? Yeah, that's okay. Questions from the audience and conversation? Yeah?
You come from Canada. I think that we're going to Canada.
Yeah, it's been interesting, I'll say, the last year for sure. And yes.
So, what did you just say?
Oh, yeah, so what we're thinking of doing is having 5-minute general comments that we're going to each open with, and then have conversation with you out there if you want to ask any question about any topic. Yeah, well, we could do a formal debate too if you want. But the formal debate, I mean, I do have stuff up here to do a formal debate.
Yeah.
I'd like to have a 15-minute opening statement to do a formal debate, if that's what you want to do.
Okay. So there are a number of different ways we could go about this. We could do a formal debate, and we could do more of a kind of conversational dialogue. So I guess we could take a vote.
Yeah, well, I'll say that last night we had a lot of questions from the audience that went all over the place and sort of allowed people to explore all sorts of different topics and areas.
Where were you last night?
What was the group? It was in Phoenix, I forget.
Yeah.
The Humanist group in
Phoenix group, yeah.
Yeah. So, well, there's 5 minutes and there's a formal debate. Okay.
We can't make everybody happy.
Okay. I'll say this, that there are dozens of formal debates that you can see on YouTube, and this at least offers an opportunity for a lot of personal real-time engagement. So I think there's a lot of value in this as well. So let me begin. I'm going to begin by addressing some of the the realities of how different communities like Christians and atheists often do view one another, which is something I think was alluded to a couple times already this morning. I have a cartoon that I came across a few years ago that says how Christians view atheists and how atheists view Christians. And on the one panel, how atheists view Christians, or I'll say how Christians view atheists, it depicts a lot of people walking around dressed up in like devil's outfits. And then the one how atheists view Christians, it shows a lot of people walking around and they're all in the shape of peanuts. In other words, they're all nuts. I think what that cartoon reflects is a very common phenomenon, which is that people in particular communities, particular belief communities, they tend often to take very negative assessments, broad negative assessments of people in what you can call the outgroup, who are not part of that community. You see this, for example, in politics. The example I like to give, so the example I like to give is about 10 years ago, Ann Coulter, probably all know who Ann Coulter is, very strident voice on the political right in the United States. She published a book with the title, "If Democrats Had Any Brains, They'd Be Republicans." Now, what that title says, presumably, is that people who are Democrats are ignorant or irrational. They don't know enough, and that's why they don't agree with our conservative political viewpoints. On the other hand, Al Franken, around the same time, published a book titled "Lying Liars and the Liars They Tell." And he was kind of targeting George Bush and and Fox News and stuff in the mid-2000s. But just from the title, you sort of get an equal and opposite view back. So this idea that those on the conservative side of the spectrum are dishonest. They're all liars. And I think this, like the cartoon I just talked about a moment ago, reflects these common perceptions of these other communities. So all the Democrats, they're soft in the head or they're irrational or something. All the Republicans, they're cold. They don't care about the poor. They're maybe dishonest. I think that this binary opposition has gotten even worse, because you can appreciate in the last year or so, to such a point where it's almost difficult to have any meaningful conversation sometimes with people that are outside of your group. Now, as a Christian, this concerns me on both sides, because I think we are always benefited by having dialogue with one another. And I want to say a little bit about how Christians do commonly view those who are just defined as atheists. And it is often in the way of that cartoon. It's very negative and often with a moral judgment, a judgment of immorality. And I'm sure you know that often firsthand. I'm going to give you an example, though you probably don't need any examples. But this one came from John Hagee. People know who John Hagee is? He's a very popular pastor in Texas, I think Baptist. Got a church of like 15,000 people. You often can see him on TV. And I like to try to do John Hagee impressions. So this is what he actually said in a sermon a few years ago, okay? He says, "The Bible says, the fool has said in his heart, there is no God. Atheists say there is no God. Let me tell you that atheism has never painted a masterpiece. Atheism has never dispelled fear. Atheism has never healed a disease. Faith in God has, but not atheism. Atheism has never given anyone peace of mind. Atheism has never dried a tear. Atheism has never given an intellectual answer to the creation. Atheism is bankrupt and empty. It's brain dead." And he says this. Thank you.
Bravo.
He says this in a church of 15,000 people. Well, yeah, they're all Christians, and people are applauding and standing up. I mean, my first thought is, if there are any atheists in this audience, if there are any people who are on this spectrum of questioning or doubting, what do they hear? I mean, they hear, "Get out, you're not welcome." And there is also here this moral judgment of atheists. Now, he says at the very beginning, he references a biblical passage. It's from Psalm 14:1. The fool has said in his heart, there is no God. And this is something I've encountered time and again, Christians quoting this at atheists, as if this text is talking about atheists. I wish Christians would actually, those who quote it in this manner, would actually take the time to read a little bit further. I'm just going to read a little bit further in Psalm 14. Bear with me. The fool has said in his heart, there is no God. They are corrupt, their deeds are vile. There is no one who does good. The Lord looks down from heaven on all mankind to see if there are any who understand, any who seek God. All have turned away, all have become corrupt. There is no one who does good, not even one. Whatever you think about the passage, I think the first thing you have to recognize from this passage is what it is talking about is the universal human condition, that we all fail to measure up to a certain ethical standard of conduct. And I think that's true. I think we all recognize that at certain points, we fail to live up to the people we know we should be. I mean, I have this as a mundane experience on a daily basis when I come home and there are dirty dishes in the sink and I know I should just quietly do the dishes. And instead, if I do them at all, I start doing them and make a really loud racket so that my wife knows I'm doing the dishes. This never works positively. But that's me being irrational. But I think we all fail. I mean, another place I fail commonly is in traffic. I'm pretty terrible in traffic. What is happening here is when Christians cite the first verse without paying any attention to the context of this passage, and then use it to marginalize another group and justify this sweeping indictment or condemnation, this moral condemnation, they completely miss what this chapter is about, which is for a person to look in the mirror and see themselves. What I've discovered over several years is I can think of Christianity and atheism as something like Canada and the United States. Or any two neighboring countries, but let me just stick with these two. So let's say that Canada is one of these countries, and Canada is one of these belief systems, and the United States is the other one of these belief systems. What people might initially think is, wow, if I'm from Canada, then I'm going to agree with Canadians and think the way as all other Canadians think, and I'm just not going to agree with any Americans because they're not part of my community. But what I've discovered is that I'm from Vancouver originally, and just across the border from Vancouver is Seattle. And I actually, culturally, in terms of belief and politics, I'm much more likely to share a whole lot with people from Seattle than with people from other parts of Canada. Likewise, people from Seattle are likely to share a whole lot more with the average Vancouverite than they are with somebody from Tulsa, Oklahoma. And it's the same thing when you're talking, let's say, about belief communities like Christians and atheists. If you get out and talk to people, you realize often on a broad swath of topics, I agree a lot of the time on a lot of issues with an atheist. Yes, we do disagree with some important issues, but there's also a lot of common ground if we just begin to listen to one another. I'm just going to close with one example that I thought was quite poignant from a few years ago, and it comes from Pope Francis. Now, I'm not a Catholic. And certainly there's a lot with the Catholic Church that concerns me, but I think Pope Francis has been a relative breath of fresh air in a lot of the things he's done, at least. And I just want to give you one example. So you remember I said that Christians have often viewed atheists with the rhetoric of being fools. Well, a few years ago, Pope Francis met with then President of Uruguay, Jose Mujica. And Mujica is a famous atheist. Here's the interesting thing, that Pope Francis and Jose Mujica both have a commitment to humility in living and to poverty. Pope Francis comes from the Franciscan tradition, and he has chafed against the pomp and circumstance of the Catholic Church in Rome, often to the consternation of the cardinals. As for Jose Mujica, he was famous because he rejected living in the presidential palace and instead kept living in his modest homestead, driving a 30-year-old Volkswagen and living with a 3-legged dog. It's pretty cool. They met, the atheist and this leader of the Catholic Church, the largest body of Christians on the planet. And after this 2.5-hour meeting, Mujica described the Pope as a friendly neighbor. And the papal office in kind responded as follows: "The Pope is very pleased for having met with a wise man." That's what I think I'm after in the book that we wrote, is to have some conversation At the end of the day, we still disagree pretty fundamentally about some big issues. But there's also a lot of common agreement. And there's also a common desire to better understand the other and to pursue truth in conversation.
All right. So about 4 years ago, 4 years and a week ago to be exact, I flew to Edmonton on the invite of an atheist group on campus at the University of Alberta. And there I debated a Christian apologist there. And upon my arrival in town, I met with Randal. We had a few exchanges online, and he was doing a podcast at the time, and so he interviewed me for his podcast. We had a nice exchange, and then 2 years after that, I was invited back to have a debate with Randal. And as we finished that debate, I think we both recognized that the debate we had that evening was interesting in a way, because a lot of these debates are filled with catchphrases and kind of hostile behavior between the participants. And I think we actually had a really substantive dialogue on the issues, on some of the more interesting philosophical issues surrounding the debate between atheists and theists. And as a result, a few months later, Randal and I decided that a book project would be a fantastic way to kind of continue the value that we got from that original debate. And so here we are again. Last week, actually, I was in Edmonton, and we had a few of these dialogues. We had a debate up there at Randal Seminary, and I think all of these kind of dialogues, we've both garnered a lot of value from them. And that is not to say that we don't disagree profoundly on a lot of things. I think that we both have arguments for our views, and we both have pretty bold criticisms of each other's arguments. But at the end of the day, we respect each other for the inferences that we've made, and we disagree, but we do so in a way that preserves the spirit of investigation into the topic. It's an investigation that we both respect. We both appreciate the philosophical conversations behind these things, and in the tone with which we carry it out. And so today, I think we'll have some more dialogue, and we'll continue and perhaps interact with some of you guys and some of your questions about perhaps our reasons for holding the views that we do, and the reasons that we might be critical of each other's reasons for holding the positions that we do. So I invite the dialogue. So do we want to have just raise hands then, and how do we want to?
Well, if you guys can come up towards the front and use one of the mics, then we can record the whole conversation, and everybody who's watching it later can
Should I put this on the floor then, you think? And then I can stand up at the podium?
observe the whole thing.
Oh, okay, he's got a mic. Excellent. So one thing in these kinds of question and answer periods that can be a bit draining is if people want to read a book to you or something, right? They have a lot of commentary rather than a question. And so what I would like to do is try to, as much as possible, voice your comments, but then get to a question fairly quickly so that we can have a good dialogue. That's what I think is a good way to move forward with this.
I'll start off with a little story. My father-in-law is a Presbyterian minister. He's in the liberal side of the church. And I have discussions with him at times. And he gets pretty upset with the conservative Christians. And I say, well, why don't you speak out about this? And he quoted Reagan's 11th commandment, thou shalt not speak badly of another Christian. So that brings up my question. What is your definition of a Christian? Atheist is pretty well self-explanatory. And most people would say that a Christian is somebody who accepts Jesus Christ. That begs the question, what does it take to accept Jesus Christ?
Great question. So first of all, I would say that I do have to stand. I have this thing about standing when I answer. So I think the first thing is there actually is a lot of disagreement as to what is an atheist. Some people define atheism as belief that there is no God. Other people define atheism, and this is a trend I see more recently in the last 15 years, as being without belief in God, which is consistent with what was traditionally called agnosticism. So there are various disagreements among people who applied the name atheist to themselves as to what would be an atheist in good standing. And you do find that same disagreement among Christians. I think when we talk about what is a Christian, certainly minimally this is a person who is following Jesus Christ, right? That now, what do they have to believe about Jesus Christ? Well, traditionally, what I can talk about is the mainstream Orthodox perspective is an understanding that Jesus is the incarnate Son of God, that he died for the sins of creation and for the healing of a broken creation more broadly. There's, of course, a lot of disagreement as to interpreting what that is and what that consists of. Commitment to an understanding of God as, in some sense, triune, so three distinct persons. There are some people, of course, who apply the name Christian to themselves, who do not accept, say, this idea of the Trinity. So oneness Pentecostals would be a well-known example of that, or Unitarians. So that would be sort of the essence, I would say, and then you could add on to that. But I would say, again, that these are the same kinds of issues that of complexity that you find in any diverse community. So I talked about politics a minute ago. Well, what makes for a good Republican? Is it membership in the Republican Party? Is it voting for Republican people? Is it espousing a political ideology? And there's going to be disagreement among that as well. So it's a great question, but it's certainly not an easy one to answer. In a sense, it depends on who you ask. I think a good way just to go forward with it is to begin with the sort of the broadest, most widely held mainstream opinions, and then the further you go out from there, you would have a decreasing degree of conviction the less widely held a particular opinion is, whether you're talking about what is a Republican, an atheist, or a Christian.
What does God say that Christian is anyone who calls himself?
We got
Do you have
questions.
another question or comment?
I also was from Vancouver, and so welcome to Tucson. Is this not on? No. Okay, I just have a couple of questions, a couple that I was thinking about through the night last night. At what age were you indoctrinated into the Christian religion? And and I think you've answered that it's a Protestant religion rather than a Catholic religion. As it can mean the difference between going to heaven and going to hell. As my mother said, all Catholics are going to hell because they haven't got it right. And the other question is, what made you choose the Christian religion over Islam, Hindu, Sikh, Buddhism, Mormon, or no religion altogether that had you go to there?
Okay, thank you. So 2 points there. I think, first of all, the way you phrased the first point, to indoctrinate, implies a lack of critical reflection, which I think is indicative of my first concern, that a representative of a Christian opinion is necessarily indoctrinated, that they cannot reasonably hold those beliefs on reasonable conviction. And so I would dispute the assumption, I think, behind the way the question was phrased, that I was necessarily indoctrinated into my beliefs.
What age did your parents, I would take it as being your parents, but what age did they start taking you to church?
Yeah, well, I grew up within the church, but let's say Richard Dawkins, for example. So Dawkins, in one of his essays, I think it's in Viruses of the Mind, he talks about taking his daughter out in the countryside, and they're looking at the flowers, and he asks his daughter, or his daughter's commenting on the beauty of the flowers, and then he asks her, well, what were the flowers, what are they there for? And she says, well, I think that they were there to enable the bees to make honey and just to be beautiful. And Dawkins responds to her, I was sorry to tell her that it was, but I had to tell her that it wasn't so. Now, what Dawkins is doing there to his young child is he's conveying to her his beliefs about the nature of reality, which is fundamentally no different from what any other representative of a belief community or of a worldview does. They convey to their children what they believe to be true about the nature of the good society, about the nature of ultimate reality, about the nature of knowledge. So I don't think that we can necessarily say at the outset that one particular group necessarily indoctrinates and another particular group doesn't. For example, Barbara Ehrenreich, a well-known atheist and a fantastic writer, in one of her books, she describes how she was raised in a secular humanist household, and she said her father was so committed to his beliefs that he had a stack of Gideon's Bibles he had taken from every hotel he'd ever stayed in because he wanted to save the next occupant from the room from the dry rot that would come as a result of being exposed to this book. Now, I think what her father is doing there is conveying to her his beliefs with a deep sense of conviction as well. I think that it is not, the issue is not simply being taught a set of beliefs about reality, which is the immediate concern. The question is whether you are also encouraged to question and come to understand those beliefs for your own, to own them, based upon your own reflection and critical inquiry. And I do concede that often the Christian church has failed in this regard. They've censured this idea of questioning and doubt and reflection. They treated it as something to be concerned or suspicious of. So I would strongly be concerned about that. But I've seen that in other belief communities as well, where critical thinking and doubting can be questioned and censured. And sorry for a long-winded answer, but let me just come to the second question. Why one belief system rather than another? I think that's a question that every one of us has to reflect on, because every one of us chooses one understanding of the nature of reality, of the nature of the good, of what human persons are, which differs from a broad swath of all the other opinions. So each one of us needs to come to own our convictions in the recognition that we are fundamentally disagreeing with many other people. And hopefully we can do that with charity and good grace.
It was like asking you specifically why you would. Of course, we all do, but I'm just interested why you particularly.
I'll just briefly respond to that, but we do need to maintain the order of the queue and the microphones. No problem. So the short answer is for myself, I've written a few books explaining why I hold the views I do. So there's one of them is on sale. One of them is on sale outside, but there are other ones as well. Do you want to respond, Justin?
Yeah. So I agree with Randall with respect to, I don't think that there's anything intrinsically wrong with persons who have a certain view and then having children and then imparting that view to the children. To say, if I believe something is true about the world, of course I'm going to tell my children this and hope that they believe it as well. I think the important distinction, and Randall brings this out, is doing so with a kind of tentative attitude of encouraging curiosity, encouraging investigation, that the person comes to their own reasons for thinking those things to be true as well. That someone not just take things at face value, right? And so I think that's an important distinction is, look, I'm an atheist. If I don't plan on having kids, but if I ever do, I'm going to tell them that this is how I think the world is. That's not inconsistent with me also saying that I think that they should investigate these issues for their own sake. And I think that that's the kind of dual-pronged view that I think is important. And I don't think that therefore telling your children how you view the world is indoctrination, so long as, again, there's a spirit of openness and curiosity and investigation imparted along with it. So.
Thanks. I would like to suggest a strong area of agreement that I think hopefully atheists and Christians and all religious and secular people of goodwill can agree on. And I would suggest that project be the retaking or reclamation of the pro-life label, which has been usurped, of course, by the anti-abortion people. And I'm suggesting that we agree on just a set of principles that enhance life, whether it's, embracing the need to address climate change, the need to reject war and militarism as a means of foreign policy, because it just inflicts misery and death. And we should shift priorities to, healthcare and medical research and the cancer moonshot that was discussed under the Obama administration, as well as even Peter Thiel's quest for life extension, even though he's a libertarian and probably wouldn't support universal health care. But to embrace these ideals that maybe would shift the abortion question to the periphery in terms of, life or death, but can we kind of use that as a starting point, the general idea that life is our greatest good, and we should commit to all public policies that extend both the quality and quantity of life?
I certainly would have no objection to that. I think that those are all great principles. I think that though it should be said that for someone who does think of abortion as the ending of life, I think that that those kinds of concerns aren't going to they're going to be important to them, but they're not going to be necessarily inconsistent with also saying that we shouldn't be having abortions, right? Because their principles are. It's really at a fundamental level. It's a difference about what the unborn is, right? It's a philosophical question. It's a scientific question, and I think that both sides could, in principle, endorse all the views that you said there, while still disagreeing on the abortion issue. But for myself, I'm right on board with you.
Yeah, I would basically echo that. Again, I'm not a Catholic, but this is going to be my second Catholic reference. I might get in trouble from my Baptist brethren for citing Catholics all the time. Just kidding. Ha ha ha. In 1996, Pope John Paul II, though he published an encyclical called an Evangelium Vitae, or Gospel of Life. And while I'm sure you wouldn't agree with everything in there, but what he does is he wants to say the Catholic Church needs to have a much broader conception of the importance of life. Now, in his case, of course, it includes prohibition of contraception, abortion, but it also extends to repudiation of militarism, of capital punishment. And I fully agree that I think, say, Christians, for example, they've had this, often, evangelicals in particular, which is sort of my camp that I come from, have had a very narrow conception of what moral issues are. So they've thought about being pro-life is protecting the fetus. And then, so what about post-parturition? What about the child born? And what about climate change? What about the fact that there could be 1 billion climate refugees in a century? Are we concerned about that? Are we concerned about the planet? Are we concerned about industrial agriculture? You could go on and on and on. Those are all issues. Are you concerned with animal welfare and sentient animal suffering? I'm still an omnivore, but I really wrestle with the moral implications of eating sentient creatures. And I haven't worked through that. So, I sort of have, and I'm still eating them, maybe put it that way. I'm very sympathetic with Gary Francione, who's a well-known secular ethicist, but I think has a really persuasive case against the morality of eating sentient creatures. Sometimes I think, again, we're going to find that we are failing to live up to the standards we recognize for ourselves. We have to be honest about our failures and continue to try to work on them. But I think we need to have a holistic conception. I think in a group like this, I don't know your belief community, but a free thought community, I hope there is and can be a diversity of opinions on contentious issues like the ethics of abortion and the legislation of abortion, or of euthanasia, or some of these other big questions at the beginning and end of life, because there are a range of people who thought very hard about them and come to different conclusions. And so we just need to have room for an expansive, open conversation and debate on these issues.
I think the crucial question for many of us non-believers has to do with conducting one's life as if there is no supernatural agent or agencies in the universe. So for me, although raised a Protestant, in a Protestant family, surrounded by many Catholics on the west side of Cleveland. As I got more and more educated, I came to see how much solid progress comes by way of understanding reality when you reject the supernatural entirely. It's like in engineering rejecting perpetual motion machines. So I guess what I'd be very interested in hearing from both of you is, and don't give me a dictionary definition, but I'd like to know what your definition of the supernatural is. The reason I warn against the dictionary definitions, I'll say something that violates the laws as we currently understand them. But that's not a good definition because many things become understood in the future, which means that that definition encompasses many things that are not supernatural, just haven't been understood yet. So I'd be interested in knowing what is your position regarding the definition of the supernatural, agencies or agents, whatever.
Would you like to start?
No, you go ahead.
Okay. I think sort of a prior question here is, what is the natural? And that is actually a very difficult question. I know, I'm going to promise getting to supernatural, but supernatural is a term that exists and has meaning relative to another concept, which is the natural. So it seems like a good place to begin. What do we understand to be the natural? And I'll say for most people who use the term naturalism today, what they do is they don't tie the term naturalism to any claim about what ultimately exists. It used to be that they did. So for example, Democritus in ancient Greece took the position that everything that exists is atoms and the void. So these little fundamental units of matter existing in empty space, and that's all that exists. That would be just a metaphysical account of the natural. Now the problem is that, well, what happens if scientific inquiry yields something new that we didn't know about? Then you have to adjust your definition of natural, or you have to say, well, that's supernatural. So the way that most scientists today, or I should say most philosophers, think about naturalism is that it is tied to scientific inquiry, to the objects and methods of scientific inquiry, and that what ultimately is natural is that which science can address. So typically that's how naturalism is defined. If that's what we say, and I think that's a good working definition, then what is supernatural or what is non-natural would be what science cannot address, what is beyond the purview of science to address. Now, you will encounter these terms in the literature, non-natural and supernatural, and the way that they are often defined is like this, that non-natural is something that goes beyond the objects or methods of scientific study, but it is impersonal in nature. For example, if consciousness arises from the brain, but is something distinct from what science can study, then that would be non-natural. Whereas supernatural would be something like a spiritual agency which exists beyond the universe or the objects of scientific inquiry.
Is that your definition?
Yeah, that would be what I would be working with. But like you said, these definitions don't always work. And I'm going to just throw a wrench into the mix, okay? And then I'll turn it over to you. So some scientists have speculated that a very advanced alien civilization could create a universe. I think as I recall, it's called a type 3 civilization. If that's possible, then in principle, it's possible that a type 3 very advanced alien civilization could have created this universe and the laws of nature that sustain it. And if that's the case, then by that definition, those advanced alien life forms would be supernatural because they would be agents that created this universe and can interact within it from outside it. And that seems counterintuitive also, so we may have to revisit the definition of supernatural. So the terms don't have universally agreed upon and non-controversial definitions, but that's my quick answer.
It would be natural with advanced knowledge, that's all.
Sure. So I would agree with Randall with respect to there not being really great definitions that everyone can agree on with regard to that which is natural and that which is supernatural in principle, right? So yeah, like, so in science, when we are seeking to explain things, we often bring in this notion of methodological naturalism. So what this is that within the methods of science, we limit ourselves to appealing only to natural causes and events when trying to explain some phenomenon, right? And then that, of course, that leads us to the question: well, what counts as natural causes and events, right? And I think the concerns that Randal raises are valid concerns. There isn't a really clear definition of this stuff, and so it can be a bit hazy. So with respect to the kinds of things that science can address, I think there are questions metaphysical in nature, as in the existence of God, for example, that scientific findings can, of course, have relevance to. So, for example, if we look around the world and we see a lot of animal suffering, we might ask the question, is this the kind of thing we would expect a perfectly loving God to create, right? It doesn't appear that the vast amounts of suffering in the world throughout evolutionary history, it doesn't appear that can fit terribly well within a theistic framework. But it does appear to fit better, at least with this respective data, on a view that says that there is no, all-powerful classical view of God, right? So while God isn't going to fit into our traditionally understood scientific explanations, I do think that some scientific findings can serve as premises in an argument about metaphysical concepts like the existence of God. That doesn't answer the natural-supernatural question in a direct way, but it shows that there is some crossover with the kinds of inferences we can make. And I think the theists would agree with that too, right? Sometimes they'll be looking at particular aspects of design or of fine-tuning in the universe and argue that the best explanation is something supernatural, that it can't be explained purely in natural means, that there needs to be a positing of some more metaphysical view. And so, yeah, I think that there's going to be a crossover with the kind of inferences, and I don't think there's anything in principle wrong with those approaches. Although, as an atheist, I of course find them to be not terribly compelling.
Well, first, to follow up on what you're just saying, I think your explanation for the aliens creating the universe would create a deistic God, one that's not involved in personal life. So I would say for myself, I'm an atheist when it comes to the concept of a personal God, the Christian God. I'm agnostic to the deist God. But my question that I had for you is more or less has to do with free will. As I look at especially the Christian religion, I see God's prime directive as free will. He's not going to make you love him. He's not going to make you do anything because that interferes with free will. It seems to me that free will is the most important thing to God, or his prime directive, at least the way the Christians describe it. So, if this is the case, why is it that we don't have more Christian churches teaching all of the various religious feelings and thoughts or atheistic thoughts so that their parishioners can then express their free will?
Yeah, let me deal with, thank you again for that. So let me deal with the first part of the question. There is a subset of the Christian tradition that appeals, well, I guess let me back up for just one moment and so we have to define what we mean by free will. There are two major views as to what free will is. One view says that free will is a state that is compatible with being determined to an action. And that's a view called compatibilism. So free will is consistent with compatibilism, or with determinism. The view you describe is an incompatibilist or libertarian view, which says free will is incompatible with being determined to act. And Christians have, in fact, disagreed over which understanding of free will is the preferred one. So Arminians, historically, they're defined as taking this view that we have to have libertarian free will. We can't be determined if we're going to be free. So God has to give us the space you described. The Calvinist takes the view that we are in fact determined to act and we can still be free even though we act. And I would say that same disagreement you will find among atheists. Most atheist philosophers today, most philosophers generally, are determinists. And most of the determinists believe in compatibilism. They believe that determinism is compatible with having free will. Some Christians are of the same mindset. So there actually is an interesting agreement there. And a minority of atheist philosophers would take a libertarian view, would say, no, we can't be determined if we're going to be free. So there's that background. The other issue is the issue of why don't more Christian leaders, whatever, expose people to a wider array of evidence so that they can make critical decisions, informed decisions. And I think I agree with that. I think that we should do that. I will say that I think it's simply beyond the ability of anyone in this room, me most of all, to do that in a way that is going to be comprehensive to every one of the belief systems out there. Because there's just so many ways to view the world. There are so many ways among atheists to view the world. I mean, atheists disagree fundamentally on, like I said, free will. They disagree on the nature of morality and the nature of economics and all these other issues too. What the best we can do is perhaps not try to do a comprehensive survey of all the belief systems, because that's simply beyond us, but rather inculcate within ourselves virtues, belief virtues that seek to be critical in the evaluation of evidence, to try to become aware of our own cognitive biases, our own selection bias in the way we evaluate evidence, our own motivated reasoning that tries to bring about a particular conclusion. I mean, I watch way too much politics on television today. I've been watching, there are reasonable Trump supporters, but there are also, I think, for example, in the last 2 weeks, I've been watching some of the pundits that are on cable news supporting Trump's claims about Obama's wiretapping. And up to this past Friday, they're doing this. And they're grabbing at anything they can to try to give credence to what appears to me to have no evidential basis whatsoever. That is a bald case of motivated reasoning. But I don't want to just focus on that in others. I need to try to say, okay, where am I exercising motivated reasoning in order to vindicate my own beliefs in a way that diverges from rationality? And so I think I would start there, we need to inculcate those virtues in people within our communities and then send them out to be as objective and fair-minded as they can as they evaluate other opinions.
Yeah, I would actually pretty much agree with everything you just said. So in terms of, in communities that meet regularly and the kind of issues they discuss, I think that they're going to have particular issues that they're interested in discussing. And that's going to, not as a necessarily any kind of wrong-headed way, but that's going to narrow the focus of things that they discuss, just because with any community, you're going to need to have a focus of some sort, right? And so I don't think there's anything impermissible about not exploring every possible scenario. But what I do think is important is again, kind of encouraging and fostering an environment of critical thought, such that, giving people the tools, such that when they do go out and they do experience these other claims and they come across these different cultures and different ideas, that they have a tool set with which they can assess these claims in a way that best preserves a kind of rationality within them, kind of reduces all the different motivated reasoning, other cognitive biases that we're all subject to. I think that to some degree, I think that this is obviously unavoidable to completely cut ourselves off from our cognitive biases. But I think that becoming aware of these things and how these biases operate within us can lead us to a better awareness of keeping tabs on our own thinking, essentially, thinking about our own thinking, how we assess claims and things like that. And those kinds of tools that we can build into our communities, be they church communities, be they secular communities, be they political parties, I think that these kind of tools are really what needs to be the ultimate focus, rather than exploring and teaching particular conclusions. The tools, I think, are more fundamental and important.
Is this on?
Yep.
First, I'd like to thank both of you for a refreshing discussion on some serious issues, interesting issues, and that neither of you are captive to tribes or ideologies. It's rare and much appreciated. My question because of that is, since you've known each other and been engaged in debate and discussion, for each of you separately, what have you most learned from the other person that has most significantly changed your philosophy or theology that you feel is a growth in your own life?
That's a fantastic question. So, as I noted, Randal and I have known each other for at least 4 years now, and what I would say is something I've learned in my interactions with him is the complexity that comes with a person who identifies as a Christ follower. We all have, as Randal pointed out, we all have caricatures that we view, and there are caricatures of us secular individuals. And those caricatures are, of course, not terribly helpful in actually understanding where people are coming from and what people's values are and what their goals are, right? And I think the same is true, of course, about views of Christians. And coming to better understand Randal and where he comes from, his political views and how his religious views influence them, and vice versa. And like Randal and I actually have a large amount of common ground when it comes to certain political issues. But metaphysically, we are as different as night and day. Seeing that complexity is valuable for me because it allows me to, in future interactions, approach conversations more cautiously, to not bring to the conversation assumptions about the individual I'm about to interact with. And that can be, I think, of value to having that particular conversation have actual substance to it, rather than, as so often happens, people talking past each other. It's always good to just know when to listen, know when to interact, and have that kind of patience to recognize and appreciate complexity within another individual.
I appreciate his one argument he makes for the degree of religious disagreement being prima facie evidence for the non-existence of God, that one would expect, if there were a God, that there would be greater agreement among people as to what God required of us and what his nature was. I think that that's important evidence that one has to consider. And certainly coming from a Christian tradition where I'm well aware of the diversity of opinion that exists within my own community, let alone other religions around the world and other belief systems and philosophies, I think that's a formidable challenge anyone has to consider. I think one of the best things that each one of us can do is to try to argue the other side. And so one of the debates I did last year was with a philosopher named Michael Roos, who's a very well-known atheist philosopher. And he's teaching in Florida now. He's retired, well, semi-retired, I think. But we did a debate on a British radio show that's online where I defended atheism and he defended Christianity. And I think those kinds of things are stretching experiences, because what you're going to find is you really learn a position, another person's position, when you're the one who has to defend it.
Okay. I respectfully disagree with your assessment of the answer of Richard Dawkins to his daughter. He did not tell her what to think. He did not implant anything in her head. He made her question it. He left her with nothing. He, in a way, I would understand it, had I been this little daughter, is, well, actually, you see how you feel about it instead of seeing why they do it. You are talking about yourself, not about them. Think about it. So there was no brainwash there. There was if he implanted anything, was a doubt or a question mark in the way he thought. Well, this is it.
Sure.
This is what I want to tell you.
Thank you. So I think that the beginning of your question or your comment is to say, I disagree. That's great. You know, we can have reasonable, friendly disagreement.
If we go to a bar.
Yeah. If every conversation is always like, yep, I agree, that gets pretty boring after a while, right? We can have a little bit of disagreement. And now to come back to that, let me just say two more things about it. About first that specific case, I do think the assessment I gave of the instance I cited is correct, and this is why, because what his daughter appeals to is what is called teleology or purpose in nature, which is back to Aristotle in ancient Greece, before Christianity, is a common view of the world, is to see that there is teleology or there's purpose written into nature itself. And what Dawkins is doing is he says, his words are, I was sorry, but I had to tell her it wasn't so. So that what he is doing, he's saying this view of nature, which goes back to Aristotle, that there is purpose or telos written into natural processes and structures, is not true. He does say that. He doesn't just say question whether or not it's true. He tells her it's not true, which is conveying his own beliefs. My second point I would say, though, is everyone has to do that at some point. We can't simply have, back to a very small child, just tell them to question everything. You have to give them some foundation on which to start and to build from. And I'll just give you one example. So imagine a 7 or 8-year-old child is watching the evening news with his parents, and he hears about ISIS beheading a person in the Middle East. And he asks his parents, how could they do that? Now, his parents can take one view, and they can say, well, people disagree as to the ethics of that action. Some people say there are morally sufficient reasons under which you can behead a person, and other people disagree with that. And these are the various opinions ethically and in terms of the political, socioeconomic, and religious causes that bring about an event like that. And now you as a 7 or 8-year-old can work that out for yourself. But I think that most people recognize that at the age of 7 or 8, a child isn't able to process all those options and deal with those complexities. So I think most of us instead are going to be inclined to tell that child what our conception of a good society is. Hopefully, again, equipping them to the extent they're able at that age with thinking critically about it for themselves. But we probably are going to be pretty unqualified in condemning that action. And so I think that we can't help as good parents, as good grandparents, as good leaders in society to be, to some extent, simply conveying what we believe to be true with the appropriate humility and an open mind.
So in other words, you're saying that everybody is brainwashed and everybody is brainwashing their children.
No, I don't think that is brainwashing. Brainwashing is when you inhibit critical thinking. And I don't think that telling a person you believe something is true is in and of itself equivalent to brainwashing.
It's okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you again for being here. It's refreshing to have two sides, a merger, if you will, of points of view. Alice and I were married a month ago, and I'm a Christian, and Alice is a founding member of Free Thought Arizona. The bottom line is we're supported and loved, indeed we are. At our reception, there were Free Thought Arizonans, people from my congregation, Muslim, Jews, a number of different belief systems of people that were there, our friends. Pit that against the biblical statements, quote, you cannot serve two masters, end quote. And the second one, quote, let the weeds grow with the crop and the harvest only, and harvest only the crop when it's ripe, end quote. The question is, how can you take this dichotomy and further address it?
Well, so the first one, the question of one cannot serve two masters, as I recall, what Jesus is addressing there is one's commitment to God and mammon, or to money, or to material commitments. And I think that that is actually a challenge that goes to the heart of North American Christianity. You know, the average North American Christian tithes, and by tithe, I mean donates to any charitable organization, to a church, to a non-governmental organization, anything else. They tithe on average about 3.5% of income. That's, I think, a pretty low standard. It's a pretty depressing standard. Do you know that divorce rates among evangelicals are the exact same, if not a little higher, than the general population? So I think that there's, and you know, when it comes to carbon footprint in the environment, I mean, I don't think evangelicals are blazing trails. Do you know, I mean, it's been ironic. I think every single person since I've been down here that I've talked to about cars, they drive a Prius, or they drive, yesterday I was driven around in a Chevy Volt, which has a much lower carbon footprint than my Ford Mustang. Now, I don't drive much. I only drive about 6,000 miles a year, but what's that? Time to convert, yeah, it's a guilty pleasure. It's like my eating of animals. It's something I wrestle with. But I think that we have to start by seeing these passages as an indictment of our own communities. So 10 years ago, Ronald Sider, well-known Christian ethicist, he wrote a book called The Scandal of the Evangelical Conscience. And he just goes down the line how much evangelicals are failing to live up to the beliefs they profess. So I think it's a good start for us to get our own house in order. And I do have to maybe say, south of the border here, the extent to which evangelical conservatives have come behind Donald Trump is not only befuddling to me, it's deeply distressing. Because here is a man who has been married 3 times, children from the 3 different women. And I'm not saying necessarily that's a right of judgment, but I'm saying that evangelicals would judge that if it were a Democrat, right? Somebody who, Donald Trump was in softcore porn films, and evangelicals are always rallying against pornography. He was, for a long time, he was pro-choice, and then he becomes pro-choice, then he becomes pro-life. But all of that, they just sort of forget that because he's now going to be the leader of the Republicans, and so many evangelicals in the United States have become way too closely wedded to a particular political party. And I think when that happens, you lose critical distance.
Okay, I'd like to thank you for coming also. First of all, before I ask my question, I want to educate you a little bit on, you were talking about free will, and on Charlie Rowe's brain science series, the scientists are studying free will, and they are still studying it, but they said one firm thing they have found is that that it is inverse ratio to emotion. So anytime your emotions are up, your free will goes straight down. So down to my questions, and I said that plural. I have a problem with the Bible a lot because there's a lot of different printings and different churches use different Bibles. I asked a rabbi one time about the Jews, why they have so many churches in the same town, just like Christians do, because if they should be more solid in one than the Christians are. But he said, no, he says there's 10 different levels of Judaism. So I come back to the point, if Christianity and Judaism can't get it straight, there's really a separation of religions in my mind, so I don't get it. I have another problem with the part of the Bible, the Jericho part, that these people are able to blow the wall down. Recently,
archaeologists did a study on that and found that there was no wall there. So why is not that taken out of the Bible? Why do the Christians leave false statements in the Bible? The other false statement in the Bible, and you have probably know the phrase Bereshith Elohim. Do you know what those two words mean and why they disagree with every Bible printed today? It's a sad statement in Christianity to make those statements. And I'll finish with the idea that Einstein was once asked if he was religious when he was a child, and he said, "Yes, I was religious until I read my first science text." So I also want to know if you've ever read a science text.
Okay. I'm not going to begin to try to address everything, but I appreciate everything you said. Let me begin with the first thing about sort of all the disagreement. This is an old joke from Emo Phillips. Some of you, I'm sure, have heard this. This is his joke. He says, "Once I saw this guy on a bridge about to jump, and I said, 'Don't do it.' He said, 'Nobody loves me.' I said, 'God loves you. Do you believe in God?' He said, 'Yes.' I said, 'Are you a Christian or a Jew?' He said, 'A Christian.' I said, 'Me too. Protestant or Catholic?' He said, 'Protestant.' I said, 'Me too. What franchise?' He said, 'Baptist.' I said, 'Me too. Northern Baptist or Southern Baptist?' He said, 'Northern Baptist.' I said, 'Me too. Northern Conservative Baptist or Northern Liberal Baptist?' He said, 'Northern Conservative Baptist.' I said, 'Me too. Northern Conservative Baptist Great Lakes region or Northern Conservative Baptist Eastern region?' He said, 'Northern Conservative Baptist Great Lakes region.' I said, 'Me too. Northern Conservative Baptist Great Lakes region of 1879, Council of 1879, or Northern Conservative Baptist Great Lakes region Council of 1912? He said, 'Northern Conservative Baptist Great Lakes region Council of 1912. I said, 'Die, heretic,' and I pushed him off. We laugh because it's true. Because a lot of Christians have a long history, and it's not just Christians. I think often we find that we end up having the deepest disagreements with the people we share the most in common with, but Christians certainly, we have often exemplified that. And so the short answer to everything you said is to come back. When Jesus was asked to summarize the law, he said, "Love God and neighbor." And even if you don't believe in God, we can all start with the need to love neighbor, right? And by neighbor, he defined it as people from the outgroup, people you don't share much in common with. To learn to extend love and empathy and compassion to those with whom you do not agree. If everybody began to work on that, I think we'd make a lot of strides into making the world a better place.
So, yes. In the book, actually, Randal and I go back and forth on this question of religious disagreement to quite a high degree. In that book, I present an argument where I kind of draw an analogy between or about two children, right? These two children, they're being raised by a single parent, and the parent only meets privately with each child, never meets with both of them at the same time. But then, these children, they get to discussing, and they realize they have pretty big different beliefs about their parent, about how their parent wants them to behave, how their parent wants them to form a relationship with them, how to maintain a relationship with them. And these disagreements that they discover about their beliefs about the parent, of course, will introduce tensions in their relationship between the children. And this, I think, is a kind of analogy with religious belief. So among theistic believers, of course, you have beliefs about God on all different sides of moral questions, on all different sides of how best to enter into a relationship with God, and all these different things. And so I think that if a parent were to discover tension between their two children that have different beliefs about them, the parent would, of course, step into the conversation and correct who is correct, who is wrong, if anybody is, right? As a way to reduce that tension and to preserve the relationship there. And so I think that a plausible case can be made that God, if such a thing existed, would do the same when it comes to theistic believers. He would correct the disagreements about theology, the disagreements about morality. And so that's one of the arguments we go back and forth on in the book, and I think that this is at least one piece of evidence for the non-existence of God. But yeah, we go back and forth on the book pretty deeply on that issue.
Okay, I would like your personal reactions and your assessment on these kind of debates of Richard Carrier's work and on history of Jesus, that the existence of a historic Jesus is somewhere between one chance in 3 and one chance in 12,000.
So me personally, I am not an expert historian, but what I am aware of is that the vast majority of expert historians that have assessed that particular question have come down on the side that says that there was a historical Jesus. Now, when I say historical Jesus, this might be confusing. Historical Jesus does not mean that historians believe that Jesus did all these miracles or that he's the Son of God. They're merely talking about the existence of an individual named Jesus who garnered a following, some kind of basic minimal fact that atheists would really have no problem with in principle, right? Just a historical figure of that sense. And then they would, atheists, persons who deny Christianity would say that, there was a mythology kind of built up around this individual that is false, but nevertheless it can be tied and traced back to an actual real individual, right? So what you're referencing is a historian, a classical historian by the name of Richard Carrier, who argues that actually the evidence suggests that there was never even a person named Jesus in history. I don't find those arguments compelling, and the vast majority of scholars who discuss this issue don't find it compelling, but I've not personally assessed the arguments, and so I couldn't give you, all I can do is, as I do with climate change, for example, I'm not an expert on the thing, I just go with the expert consensus, and until that changes, as a non-expert in climate science, I'm going to feel safe subscribing to the expert consensus. And so in the same way, I subscribe to the expert consensus among historians that say that this person of Jesus was at the very least a historical individual.
I think I would be broadly in agreement with Justin on that. So Richard Carrier is attempting to apply Bayesian reasoning to historical methodology, to historiography, and that is a very, I don't say fringe in a means of marginalizing him, but it's fringe in the sense that it's a very much a minority position among historians that that's an appropriate and helpful way to do historical research. Most focus rather on a sort of inference of the best explanation process where you take all the data and then you have hypotheses and you seek to say, well, which hypothesis to explain the data has the greatest explanatory scope and power and simplicity. And I think that that's a more helpful way to do historical research. There's a lot of concern about the intuitions behind plugging in probability assessments at the beginning. And it is true as a general observation, I think, when it comes to fields of experts in various areas, I think we ought to defer to the experts. If there is a consensus that has emerged, we ought to defer to that unless we have a good reason not to. And whether it's climate change, whether it's biological evolution, of course, you get Christians who are very cavalier about rejecting a consensus of experts when it comes to the evolution or the age of the universe or the earth or something else. And I think likewise here, when it comes to, there's a broad consensus among ancient historians on the existence of Jesus. I think we have to take that seriously. It doesn't mean they're right. Sometimes the consensus is incorrect, but at least take it seriously.
Okay, Randall, you mentioned earlier that children at a young age are incapable of rational thought or rational reason. And I'm paraphrasing you a bit, but that was what I interpreted as the general consensus. And but your book, the Bible, says, train up a child in the way it should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. Right. And then they tell that child, when he's 3, 4, 5, 6 years old, if you don't believe the way we want you to believe, you're going to burn in hell forever. So you're basically taking that child's reason when he gets older away from him, because he's so afraid. And I can speak for myself. When I started questioning, I was so afraid that I was going to burn in hell for questioning what God said. And then growing up in a black church, which is based on emotion. The pastor gets the band going and everybody's up jumping and shouting in the aisles. It's real hard to use rational thought in those circumstances. How can you say that's not brainwashing when you tell a child, if you don't believe the way we want you to believe, you're going to burn in hell forever?
It's guilt and fear built in.
Yes.
Yeah, there's so much there, so much in that. So, for example, the very end of your question comment, you raised concerns, I think, about the charismatic tradition and anti-intellectualism within the charismatic tradition. I mean, I grew up in the Pentecostal denomination, and it's got strengths. It's also got a disconcerting anti-intellectual tradition to it, which I think that tradition needs to become more aware of and wrestle with. Beyond that, let me distinguish between two different issues. The general point and then the specific point about hell and manipulation and fear. The general point I was addressing is the point that every individual, not just children, but throughout our lives, we all need to take testimony at face value at certain points, because we don't have the wherewithal or capacity to investigate the issues for ourselves simply based on our assessment of the evidence. Justin just cited an example from climate change. I am never going to become an expert capable in all the fields relevant to assessing the impact of fossil fuels on the climate. So I have to defer reasonably to what I see to be the testimonial consensus at that point. And that's true as well in a young age when I'm talking about how do you equip children to make moral judgments about the behavior of ISIS in the Middle East or something. We have to begin at some point with our conception of the good society as best we understand it. We can't just give them the moral landscape of debate at the age of 7 or 6 and tell them to figure it out for themselves. We have to give them a place to stand on and build from there. So I think that's true of every belief community. And I don't think that's contrary to reason. I think reasoning, which is the proper movement from premises to conclusion, depends on having a foundation or a premise to begin with. So I think you do have to start somewhere. Now the question of hell and the topic of hell. Well, this is one that is a lamentable aspect of some forms of Christianity, that the doctrine of hell has been used as a form of manipulation and fear and quashing of questions in people. And I think that is something that the church, to the extent that it still occurs, they need to wrestle with. There was an evangelist in the 19th century in the Catholic Church who was an evangelist to children. His name, I kid you not, was Father Furnace. It was spelled Furniss. But he gives these lurid descriptions of children wrestling forever, thrashing about forever in ovens and things like this in order to instill within them the desire to repent and join the Catholic Church. And I think that kind of stuff is horrifying. So I share that concern, and I think that we need to always be careful about manipulation. Now, manipulation of that kind can occur in many belief communities, but in the Christians, traditionally, that was how it was expressed, and we have to be very careful about that.
And I think also important is to note that there is a wide variety of understanding of what hell actually means. Yeah, you can find passages in the biblical text that seem to suggest the kind of view that I think, the kind of cartoonish view that we all have of devils and pitchforks and things like that. But there are as many passages that are like that. There are other passages that suggest that it's quite different from that. It's not this kind of perpetual, eternal torment. And so that's a position available to Christians. And I actually don't know what your view is on that, but so I guess I'd be interested in what is your view on that?
So there are, since you asked, there are these there are many different views of hell. There's the traditional view, which I think you probably got, is this view that people who end up in hell punitively suffer eternal conscious torment forever. Wailing and gnashing of teeth. Yeah. So let's go with that phrase for a minute. What is Jesus talking about when he speaks about the wailing and gnashing of teeth? And the way that I was raised, and the way many Christians were raised to interpret what that was and what that refers to, is people who are crying out because they've missed their chance and now they're stuck in hell forever and they're not going to get another opportunity. But in fact, the Greek there for gnashing of teeth seems to refer to an expression of rage. So for example, you find in Acts chapter 7 something similar. In Acts chapter 7, Stephen is described as the first Christian martyr. The people, the leaders of the wider Jewish community there stoned him to death, and they gnashed their teeth at him to express rage at him. Now what that suggests, and this is the second view, is not that hell is about God retributing or God expelling his wrath, pouring out his wrath on people and punishing them forever, but rather God relenting to people who don't want to have anything to do with him. That would be a very different picture. And whether or not you agree with the theology there, and of course I assume you don't, a good thing to do is to try to find, well, where's the common point of agreement? And perhaps it's here, that I think many of us, we know that we can get into self-destructive cycles where we become so angry at another person that it begins to consume us and it takes away our own happiness and joy. And we would rather not find reconciliation. We would rather not find happiness with that other person and be reconciled with them and move on. We would rather live with our own rage and anger. And in one of my, a book I wrote, which hasn't come out yet, it's coming out maybe next year, I give a trivial example of this, but I think it hopefully gets at the nub. So I talk about when I was in kindergarten and we baked gingerbread cookies. And at the end of the day, we all went to the back to pick up our gingerbread cookie, and mine had blue Smarties candy buttons, and it was missing. And there was another cookie left behind that was not mine, but the teacher said, well, you know, they all taste the same, just take this cookie. And I was so angry at that. I took that cookie and I went out, and then my mom picked me up and was driving me home, and then she said, well, you know, I'll take you to the mall tomorrow and buy you a toy. And I wasn't gonna let that, I wasn't gonna get over it and let it go. And so I just got angrier and angrier as we drove home. And then she says, well, you know, all cookies taste the same. And I didn't care. And when I finally got home, I walked out to the edge of beside our house, and I took that cookie and I threw it as far as I could into the ravine. And I felt the hot tears come running down my cheeks. And I wanted to punish my mom. I wanted to punish my teacher. And most of all, I wanted to punish that idiot who took my cookie. That's a very trivial thing. But I think it gets at something that we all can wrestle with at one moment or another, which is to choose anger and rage and bitterness rather than to choose to be reconciled with and forgive others. And so whether or not you agree with that second view of hell I described, perhaps we can agree with the underlying sentiment that we all need to be concerned about that within our own lives.
Okay, one, I have to say that Richard Dawkins is a preeminent biologist in the world. I think he should be able to tell his own child about flowers and everybody else's child because he actually knows what he's talking about. I had to say that. And actually, to follow up a little bit on what Steve was talking about, recently I've had some discussions with some good friends of mine who are strong Christians, and as well as a relative. And what I'm finding is they kind of have the idea they can't talk me out of being an atheist, but they're going at this by saying, like, but we're so concerned about you going to hell. How can we address that with, you know, friends or relatives, like, to say, like, you don't have to worry about me. I mean, I say, well, I don't believe in hell, so I don't think it'd hurt me. But how do you talk to a Christian about that?
Okay, great question. Two quick responses. First, on the Dawkins thing. I mean, Dawkins is an evolutionary biologist, and when it comes to evolutionary biology, I will surely defer to Dawkins. What he's talking about, though, in terms of whether there's telos or teleology in nature or not, is not a scientific question. It is a philosophical question. So he's going beyond his area of expertise in talking about philosophy. I never said he's not justified in doing that as well. I would just say, let's recognize he is doing it. So we're all taking our belief systems and interpreting the world through them and conveying them to our children. Now on this sorry, what was okay, people worried about you going to hell. I'd say a hermeneutic of charity, or a way of interpreting that charitably, would be to say that the thing you can appreciate in what they're expressing, even if they don't always express it in the best way, is they're concerned about you and they care about you. And I think maybe that much you can find some appreciation for. Say, well, thanks, I'm glad you're concerned about me. This is why I disagree, but I just at least appreciate the sentiment.
Yeah, my family is they're still all Christians, and so when I deconverted, when they learned about this, my mother in particular had a very difficult time with this, because on her view, there's something rather unpleasant waiting for me upon my last breath, right? That's her view, and that's what she thinks is going to happen. That's what she thinks is true about the world. And unfortunately, there's very little I can do to kind of dissuade her fears on that. And that's just an uncomfortable fact about the kind of disagreement that exists in the world, right? I deeply wish there was something I could do to kind of, make her less worried about that. But there really is nothing I can do. If I try and argue with her that there is no such thing as hell and that there's nothing to worry about, that introduces a tension into our relationship that isn't really going to help, unfortunately. And so that's just an uncomfortable fact about life and disagreement that I wish there was something to do about, but I'm largely helpless in that respect. So I wish I had advice, but just maintain the relationship is all I can say. We largely avoid those issues, and we put them to the side for the most part, and see what goodness we can pull out of the relationship, ignoring that one issue. So.
Hi. I appreciate your tolerance of each other, and it's really been interesting for me. But I'm just curious, what evidence would you offer of God to atheists? I'm just very curious.
Yeah, so as I said, I've written a few books on that. And so some of the things I would talk about are metaphysical arguments, for example, from the contingency of the world. I really like epistemological arguments, or arguments from the nature of knowledge and the nature of moral knowledge. I argue historically for minimal facts about the understanding of Jesus not only having existed, but having been resurrected, and that being a reasonable conclusion based upon appropriate historical methodology in the first century documents. So there's a wide range of arguments. There are literally hundreds of arguments on each side, right?
But I'm talking about evidence that you could see or felt, or you saw, actual evidence. You asked somebody a question.
So yeah, so the question assumes an empiricist belief that our beliefs about conclusions are always based upon things that we experience through sense perceptual faculties, which, first of all, I would not accept that as a requirement for good evidence. There are a broad range of lines of evidence one can draw upon.
So with regard to evidence, I think it's important that we get clear on what exactly it means for something to be evidence for something else. So for example, usually what people mean when they talk about evidence is just some fact about the world that two persons can agree upon, at least two persons can agree upon, that supports one particular explanation over some other explanation. So you have these competing hypotheses, right? And then you have the data in the middle. What hypothesis does that data support? Now, I agree with Randal in that there are arguments on both sides of this stuff, and I think that there are some evidences that are better explained on a theistic view. I'm an atheist. I think that the majority of the evidence strongly favors an atheistic view, but I would not endorse the position that there is no evidence for God. I think that would be to ignore or to misunderstand the hypothesis on offer, the theistic hypothesis on offer. So, for example, the idea of God that we might want to consider some kind of morally perfect being who cares and finds value in the existence of agents capable of interacting and making moral decisions, for example. On atheism, starting from the beginning of the universe, we might ask the question, well, how likely is it to be the case that we would observe moral agents of the kind that we have here today? It's pretty unlikely, but nevertheless, that's the world we find ourselves in. On theism, though, that's kind of expected. So the existence of moral agents is at least one bit of evidence for theism, even if, and that's something we can recognize, even if we think that the majority of evidence supports atheism, as I do. But I think recognizing how the complexity of different evidences out there can weigh differently on different hypotheses, I think it's a valuable thing. And that's actually one of the things we discuss in the book about how weighing the evidence in an honest way is important. Now, again, of course, Randal and I disagree on how the scales come out at the end, but I think that conversation is valuable.
Are you saying is there any question that we live in a cause and effect world?
No, I think that we do live in a cause and effect world, absolutely.
So would Randall agree with that?
Yes.
Yeah. So the question of specific theological claims is going to be a specific question addressing a specific form of theism.
In particular, it's a miracle claim. So
Right.
we could talk about what miracles are and so on, which is another conversation.
So we could say that all miracles are false, but
Well, we
theoretically,
have to define what miracle is first, which is actually not that easy.
sure.
There's one last statement in relation to the hell idea. The Pew reports came out a few years ago that more than 50% of Christians do not agree or believe in hell anymore. And whenever a Christian asks me or states I'm going to hell because I'm not a Christian, I say it's quite all right. Yeah, the Texans have it air conditioned now.
Okay, my turn. I'm here again. I want to tell you a story, a little story that I heard from an Indian from India, not from here. An Indian atheist, which is a rare thing, but it exists. Well, his story is about this person who was decided by his church that he should go to India to convert the natives there to the true religion, which is, of course, Christianity, etc. And he said, but how would I do it? I don't know what I'll say to them. And they said, that's simple. You tell them three things. You tell them about the virgin birth. Then you tell them about the crucifixion. And then you tell them about the resurrection. And they'll be convinced. It's very simple. Okay, they forced him, the pressure. He went to India. And he went to this village, and they gather all the villagers. They announce that there will be something, and they, no big problem. There is enough room on the floor to sit. And he tells them about the virgin birth. So the villagers said, Bhavanga. Not bad. So the next thing he tells them about he goes on to tell them about the crucifixion. And they say, Bhavanga. And then he said, well, the resurrection. And they say, Bhavanga. Well, great success. And he said, well, now I need to go to the next village. And he looks at the map and he asks them, what about this? It seems that this is the road to get to the next village. And they said, no, don't take this road. It is covered with Bhavanga. The cows go there.
This is a funny group, I've got to say. You could have like a Netflix comedy special with the material in this room. We could have a Netflix comedy special with the material in this room, the jokes in this room.
So I'm sort of, with all these arguments, and hearing more and more about religion, especially about Christianity, which I'm sick of, but any other religion, which is the same category for me. I just always think it's bavanga.
Yeah, I see that. It's unfortunate from my perspective, because I do think that what I was trying to aim for was to inculcate or develop more charitable and nuanced means of engaging other people, and to recognize other people do have different experiences, different evidence sets, and different reasoning processes, and can reasonably come to different conclusions, just as you have in politics. I don't think that every Republican is full of bavanga or whatever. I think that they can reasonably disagree in some respects on policy proposals and building the good society, and we need to work on those disagreements.
I think we got last question here.
I just, not to bring everyone down, but on the subject of consciousness or life or consciousness after death, I think obviously the two of you would have very divergent views on that. I'm wondering if you can go into that even beyond, the obvious that atheists believe that consciousness ceases upon the extinction of life, and Christians would believe that there's some essence that somehow survives and goes to heaven or whatever your conception is. But also to place that in the context of the thesis of author Michael Harrington in his book, The Immortalist, which I don't know if you've ever heard of, but in a nutshell, he says that the modern consciousness of our mortality, since the development of science to the point where we realize that the seat of consciousness is in the brain, and when that goes, our identity, our existence, our consciousness goes with that. Even if you're religious, that once we've accepted that scientific knowledge, that it kind of drives society into a collective insanity, because there's an irreconcilable cognitive dissonance, you could say, between finding meaningfulness in life. It maybe builds on some of the existential John Paul Sartre ideas to some extent. So is there some hope via science that you would both support in terms of extension of the healthy lifespan, that perhaps is one of the more, or if not the most important question for us to come together on as a people, but it is hard to deal with because psychologically it's difficult to deal with our own mortality?
Yeah, there's a lot there. So yeah, as an atheist, I think that atheism doesn't necessarily entail this, but as an atheist, and I think the majority of atheists would agree that I don't believe that I will in any sense outlive my body, my brain, right? That makes my time here finite. And at least to that degree, I think there's a way in which I can appreciate it to a greater degree than someone who thinks that that they will never completely cease to exist. That there will be a sense in which they live on. In terms of possible technological advances by which we might extend our life here on Earth, I think those all seem very appetizing to me. I think it would be fantastic to live longer than the current human lifespan. I would be skeptical of if any kind of the notion that we might be able to transport our consciousness into a kind of robot brain or something to that effect. I'm very, very skeptical of things like that for philosophical reasons primarily, that would even be possible, or that would even be something that we would want to do or should want to do. But I mean, those are all really interesting questions, to be sure. I think that at the end of the day, there is going to be a point in life at which I would like to check out eventually. So, even if I can extend my life by, a couple hundred years or something through some kind of advanced technology, there's going to be a point at which I'm like, all right, I think I've had my share of experiences, and I'd like to kind of check out. And so, yeah, I guess yes to all of your questions. So,
I guess just the one thing I'll say is that Christianity, neither Christianity nor atheism entail an anthropology or a view of the human person vis-a-vis dualism. So there are Christians who are physicalists, which believe, in other words, they believe human beings are material things, material organisms. We live for a while, and then we cease to exist when we die, and we will come to exist again in the future at a general resurrection. But so what that is so in other words, so there are Christians who believe we are just physical beings. It's a minority view, although I don't know, it may be coming a majority view among biblical scholars and philosophers today. There's a growing number who endorse it. And among atheists, if atheism, again, this comes back to the definition of atheism. If atheism is simply the view that God doesn't exist or that I'm without belief in God's existence or something like that, then that position completely underdetermines or doesn't determine in principle what you believe about human persons, whether you believe human persons do have an irreducible non-physical component, or whether that irreducible non-physical component might survive the demise of the body. So certainly the majority view among atheists would be a physicalist position, but there's nothing inconsistent with an atheist believing in some sort of afterlife.
One last question. Are you able to stay here for lunch and join us at the cafeteria?
I believe so, right? We're not being picked up, do you know?
What time Carolyn's coming?
Okay, well, we'll stick around as long as we can.
Okay.
We'd love
Thank
to.
you. So we'll be going to lunch in room 2500 down at the cafeteria, okay? You may join us
all right.
down there.
Thank you.
Thank you.